I'm Ashy, and today I'm doing a very vibrant winter landscape painting. The sketch is pretty simple here with a horizon line, a couple of curved lines for the riverbanks, and then just a few rocks along the bank that I really want to make sure I detail in. My point of this painting was really just to demonstrate a bright, snowy landscape, but with some very vivid colors so that it doesn't look just like a stark snow scene. So for the colors, I do go super bright with yellows and oranges and some streaks of blue into the sky. So I just start with my lightest color here with the yellow and streak it in and then add some orange. Again, this is very bright and vivid, so I'm adding a lot of color here. And then after I add my warm colors, I kind of streak in those cool blues, kind of purpley blue. And I'm careful not to kind of blend it on the page, so I'm tapping in the colors instead of like using brush strokes and sweeping it in. I just tap it in and let it bleed out naturally. So I did start to add also into the river here. So I'm using a slightly more watery version of the same sky colors into the river. So it's just slightly less vibrant, slightly less saturated, but still very bright and vivid to reflect the sky colors. I started to add a little bit more color into the sky to make it a bit more vibrant because after it started to dry a little bit, it was fading out some, but my timing was off here. So because I went ahead and did the river, the sky was starting to dry. So it's not all the way dry, it's slightly damp. And at that stage, it's a really horrible time to add like wet, watery paint. So you'll see that once I start adding that, I do get some immediate just like blooms that's really obvious and intense, especially in this time-lapse like sped up version. You really see how that pigment gets pushed away. So I just dab it up with my towel and then mix up some slightly thicker paint. And because I dabbed it up, the paper is now a little bit more dry, so it doesn't get as weird. And then I can add kind of some more orange and blues in and make it blend naturally. After getting the sky and the river in, I mix up a really dark neutral with Payne's Gray and Burnt Umber to paint in some background trees. So I start with just like a line of silhouetted evergreen trees, and then I add some more like skeletal deciduous trees, so the branches, they've lost all their leaves at this point, and I add that along the horizon line. For these trees, I'm really trying to get like a natural bumpy look of these thin branches, so I'm moving pretty quickly and kind of holding the brush really perpendicular to the page, straight up and down, so that I get really thin lines. And then I kind of flick my wrist a little bit to get kind of some natural shapes, and it makes me lose a little bit of control, but maintains the thin lines. When I paint the reflection in the water, I spray with clean water first, and then I add the lines. So because the water area where I'm adding this paint is slightly damp, the paint will bleed out slightly and make it look like there's just a little bit of movement in the water. So it's a nice way to create some loose reflections. And then I use some horizontal brush strokes with just a little bit of kind of clean water to add just a little bit more ripple. So next I add a pale purpley mix to the snow. So I kind of do a wash and then I drop a little bit of extra color into the shadow areas. I also use some very like dark gray along the edges of the banks and along the rocks. And I just want to make sure that I'm leaving some white space also to demonstrate that like highly reflective snow. So the shadow areas are going to be nice and dark with this purpley color, and feeding down into gray. But then the like tops where the light is catching, especially on those rocks, I pretty much leave it white. As I'm going, I get a little bit carried away with some of the water, adding a little bit too much water, and it bleeds a little bit too much. But since it's really wet, it lifts really easily, and so I can use a minimally damp brush and kind of scrub it out, or I can tap it out with the towel, and I do a little bit of both. I also tried to add some rocks like into the river that I hadn't drawn initially, just to see if I could create a little bit more, I don't know, interest into the scene. But then I decided that I really didn't like it. So again, I can lift out really easily on those spots. So I just add a touch of water to that area and then blot up the spot with the towel, and it basically erases it. So it's a really nice technique to use, especially on a paper that doesn't stain a lot. But if you're quick enough while it's still wet, it's sitting on top, you can lift it out pretty easy. I then mix up a nice like dead grass brown color, and I use a small round brush to just flick in some grasses that are poking out through the snow. I try to do this randomly around the painting with higher concentrations along the bank and then like more sparse clusters farther from the river. In landscape painting, it's nice because you don't have to be super precise necessarily. The goal is to make it look natural, and nature is not like perfect angles, perfectly precise. That's also the hard part in landscape painting sometimes. Our brains kind of tend to be wired to repeat things. So it's easy to kind of make repeated clusters that are like equidistance apart and equal size, and that doesn't look natural. So you do want to repeat some of the same brush strokes, and you want some repeated sizes and colors and values throughout the painting to make it look cohesive, but there needs to be enough variation to make it look natural also. So one way to do that first is, and it will help create depth, is to make sure that stuff closer to you, so the bottom of the painting, is a little bit bigger and a little bit more detailed. And then as you go farther back, it's less detailed and smaller, and that will help create depth, and also that difference, that change in size is going to help create the variety as well. But if you notice like that an area just looks kind of empty, or it's looking too repetitive, you can always just add another little cluster of these grasses in between. Try not to make it equidistance apart from both clusters. So shift it so that it's, a little bit closer to one of those clusters, and that'll help create it. So after doing the grasses, I just deepen some areas along the riverbank and along the rocks just to create that higher contrast. Contrast is really important in paintings. Sometimes we get nervous to add those deep shadows, but that's what really makes the paintings pop more and makes them look more three-dimensional, is getting in some of those deep shadows. I then add some slight reflections just around the edges of the river, and then deepen some of the snow shadow colors to make it kind of look bumpy and uneven. So to do that, I'm just adding like a wash basically of the purpley color into the darker areas, but I'm doing it in a very uneven way so that it looks like there's undulations where there's lower spots that aren't catching as much light and higher spots that are reflecting more light. I then remove it from the block with a butter knife, and it's done. And I just love the contrast of the kind of bleak whiteness of the snow to the bright, vivid sky and river. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. Have an awesome day.